for today, we are speaking to Dorit Rubinstein Reiss, LLB Ph.D. She is a professor of law and the James Edgar Hervey Chair in Litigation at UC Law San Francisco, formerly UC Hastings. She specializes in vaccines law and policy, including exemption laws and tort liability related to non-vaccination. She published in law reviews, peer-reviewed journals, and blogs on legal and policy issues related to vaccines, and co-authored a book on vaccines law and policy with Professor Y. Tony Yang. Wow, that is an impressive resume, but did I miss anything? Is there anything else okay. Just want to make sure. And I'm sure you're probably gonna, I'll wait for your talk, but we have bills every single year in our legislature since COVID that provide even more ways for people to not get vaccinated or to even, get litigious when it comes to vaccinations. So I'm really looking forward to your discussion today. And with that, I'm just going to hand it right over to you, Dorit.
Thank you. So I'm, although you can take this issue in a number of directions, I'm going to focus on religious exemption to vaccine mandate because that's where I think we're seeing some of the strongest fighting. And I'm going to essentially talk about how religious exemptions affect us. Um, I'm going to make the case that people lie about religion in this context all the time. And I'm going to make a case that the courts have been very aggressive more recently in protecting religious exemptions. And part of this is going to be directly relevant to Arizona in the sense that part of it is going to talk about workplace requirement. When a private employer tries to impose a requirement and people are trying to get out of it using religion, part of it is going to be more relevant to your and some of your neighbors. But there's no smoking section on this plane. If another state gets more disease, it's going to run over to every one of us. So I'm going to start by highlighting the simple fact that there are religious exemption to both school mandates and to workplace vaccine mandates. In Arizona, as you probably know, school mandates have personal belief exemptions, which would include religion as well, and a lot of people may take advantage of them. We know that religious exemptions are generally much more common than medical exemptions. So vaccine mandates always have medical exemptions because some people shouldn't be vaccinated for medical reasons. But those tend to be much fewer than religious or personal belief exemption. Here's an example from the CDC where they looked at 2023, 2024, and the number of exemptions. So they're pointing out that there's 0.2% medical exemptions and 3.1 non-medical. So more than 100 times more. And I know I'm getting the math wrong. States that have personal belief exemptions see more than states that have religious exemption. And again, that's Arizona, because not everybody is willing to lie about religion, just some people. We know that religious exemption from vaccines increase the risk of outbreaks. More exemptions mean more outbreaks. People, as I'll say in a moment, tend to reach for religious exemption when they've been scared by misinformation into not vaccinating and use religion as a cover. And as the rates of vaccines drop, we're going to see more diseases, which is going to affect everybody. Certainly the unvaccinated, but also those that can't be vaccinated, whether because they're babies that are still too young, or because or those that have medical conditions that prevent vaccination, children with transplants, adults with transplants, children with immune compromised system or adults with immune compromised system, and so forth. People undergoing cancer treatment whose immune system is lowered, and pregnant people who find themselves with a less active immune system. People lie about religious exemption all the time. How do we know that? I think we can look at three different sources. First of all, we have surveys that ask people, why aren't you vaccinating? And those surveys tell us that the main reason people don't vaccinate is because they think the vaccines are unsafe, or because they think the diseases aren't serious, or because they think they're natural alternatives. Generally, religion isn't why they don't vaccinate. Second, if we look at what religions say, no major religion actually tells people don't vaccinate. Most of them tell people vaccinate. Now, this isn't the legal standard. When we apply the law, we're looking at the personal belief of the individual. We're asking, what does the individual believe? But the fact that no religion really opposes vaccines is some evidence that the people using religion are using it a bit of as a fig leaf. One of the problems with the fact that this is individual belief is that it's really hard to police. You can more easily police if someone is a Christian Scientist and a practicing Christian Scientist than if they sincerely believe that God doesn't want them to vaccinate. The reality is that even less major religions do not prohibit vaccines. My next slide gives an example from Christian Science. There are some very small sects, and those are generally sects that say don't use any modern medicine, that also oppose vaccine, but they're really small. The number of people who's really come to vaccine opposition because of religious reason should be minuscule, but that's not what we're seeing on the ground. This is a quote from Mary Baker Eddy, who created Christian Science. And when it comes to vaccine mandate, she's telling people, instead of quarreling over vaccination, if the law requires a vaccine, submit to this and pray. So even Christian Scientists don't prohibit believers from getting vaccinated, though they certainly don't encourage it. We also know that people lie because they say that online. Here are 3 examples. This is from a public face group. Someone is saying, it's not hard, the spelling is as people posted online, it's not hard to find Bible verses to prohibit immunization. Check out the verses that Christian Scientists use. I'm not Christian Scientist, but I use these for exemptions for my 3 sons. Clearly, this person is using religion as a cover to concerned about adverse reaction. This person too, you have a sister living that needs to get a vaccine waiver. She's worried about safety. She's worried about developmental issues, but she has to write it in a religious term, and they're looking for the best wording to lie about religion. Here's another one. I lied too. Okay. In addition, there's a whole industry to help people get fake religious exemptions, and it's re-emerged during COVID. There are anti-vaccine people who hold workshops on how do you get religious exemption. There are letters online. There are lawyers that will help you write your religious exemptions. Here's just one of many examples. Sorry, see, I got my order wrong. There are also fake churches that help give you religious exemption, and that existed before COVID as well. One is this: the Church of Universal Wisdom was created by a chiropractor in New Jersey to give people religious exemption from vaccine. The site is no longer up, but they were, for over 10 years, they were a thing that gave religious exemption to thousands of parents. Here's another new one. A Natural Law Church. This person was a musician and then decided he's a pastor and created this church that expressly gives people exemptions about vaccines. He's an anti-vaccine activist. The religious version is new. Here's an example of a workshop. Kate Corrigan, relatively young person on the scene, held a lot of workshops during COVID. I think she charged everybody $40 for a workshop to tell people how to write a religious exemption that will be accepted, including providing Bible verses and giving specific exemptions. The next slide shows her rules for religious exemption. Here's what your do and don'ts for getting a religious exemption. Don't copy someone else's letter. Don't mention abortion. The right argument you can win on religion is blood. So she's telling people, this is a religious argument you should use. It's obviously not that sincere. Write your personal religious history. Don't write about safety, because that makes people understand that you're not really about religion. And always include requests that it be confidential. So there's an industry to help people lie about vaccines. And there are a lot of people that lie to get a religious exemption. Courts have been making it increasingly harder to police religious exemption, and this is part of the court's general trend to increase protection of religious freedom. We now say that religious freedom is the most favored nations. Claims of religious freedom win over any others. We can trace this quite accurately. Until the from the 1990s until the late 2010s, the court's main guiding principle here was employment division versus Smith that says if you have a general rule, you don't have to give a religious exemption. And that decision was written by that well-known liberal character, Justice Scalia. In other words, the Supreme Court for a long time had a very strong view across party lines that religious freedom does not require exempting people from general laws. That has been changing, and we can place the dividing line from when it changed in the most meaningful ways in 2020. September 2020, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies. October 2020, Justice Connie Barrett is confirmed. Within 2 months, the Supreme Court goes from upholding COVID measures that apply to house of worship to striking down one in RCD versus Cuomo. A few months later, in 2021, in Tandon versus Newsom, the Supreme Court strikes down a California measure that applies to all in-house gathering on the ground that they treated religious in-home gathering worse than they treated secular saloons and retail stores. Justice Kagan, in dissent, commenting on what the Supreme Court did said that the Supreme Court was comparing apples to watermelons, not even apples to oranges, and essentially, Tandon stands for the idea that if you have any secular exemption, even not quite on the same ground as the religious exemption, not for the same activity, you might find yourself being pushed to provide a religious exemption from this issue. I will mention for completion that in June 2021, the Supreme Court avoided completely overturning the previous precedent of Smith. Smith is still good law. In theory, the Supreme Court says if you have a general law with no exemptions, you don't have to give a religious exemption, but it's been very much hollowed out. So where are we now? If you have no secular exemptions from a general rule, you don't have to give a religious exemption. So if you have a rule that says everybody needs to pay income tax, and there's no secular exemption, you don't have to give people who say, I have religious objections to income tax an exemption. And yet there are people who say that. That was actually a real case. If you have evidence that your rule, even if it looks like it's general, was motivated by hostility to religion, you're going to have to meet strict scrutiny, and it's a very high bar to meet. So if you have a law that covers religious groups, seems to be general, but you have some evidence from the legislative process that the issue was hostility to religion, and this is hostility to religion writ broadly, you may have to give a religious exemption. This came up, for example, in 2018 in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case from Colorado, where a baker refused to make a cake for a same-sex couple, was brought before the Civil Rights Commission for discrimination based on gender orientation. And the court found that the commission showed hostility to religion by making some comments about it. If you offer any secular exemption, you probably need to offer a religious exemption. That comes up for vaccines because all vaccine mandates are going to offer medical exemptions because it makes sense to exempt people who medically can't be vaccinated. And by the way, that's one reason we want those around them to be vaccinated to protect them. This has been litigated, and courts' decisions are somewhat mixed. For example, in a case from Mississippi called Bossarge versus Edney, a district court, a low-level court, struck down found that Mississippi's school immunization law has to have a religious exemption. So now Mississippi, that didn't have a religious exemption from 1979 to 2023, has to have a religious exemption under this. But it's a really weird case because in that case, the Attorney General supported the plaintiff. In other words, nobody really argued for the validity of the law. And there are good arguments there. One argument is, like we mentioned, the medical exemptions are a lot more common than religious exemption. Another argument is the medical exemption really isn't an exemption. A vaccine mandate is everyone who can be medically vaccinated should vaccinate. The medical exemption should be built in. A third argument is medical exemption and religious exemption are different in kind. There are objective criteria for medical exemption, but not religious exemption. And we have a gatekeeper, a doctor, not perfect, but a gatekeeper, not for religious exemption. So the comparison is a little tricky, but the court in Mississippi still found that you had to give a religious exemption. There's litigation in other states. I'll get back to that. I have an example, but anti-vaccine activists are aggressively litigating this right now across states. Arizona has an exemption to its school immunization mandate, and it's very easy to get. Though, as Jean mentioned at the opening, Jeannie mentioned in the opening, there's going to be attempts to make it easier, but if you try to remove it, you'll run into legal trouble. In addition, workplace mandates have to give religious exemption in some condition. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you can't discriminate in the workplace on religion, which is interpreted to mean that employers have to give employees that object to any workplace rule an accommodation unless it's an undue burden, if the objection is sincerely religion. The courts have been making it harder to deny religious exemption, and I want to give you two examples. One example is Ringhofer versus Mayer from the Severance Clinic. In that case, plaintiff claims two things. They claim that they object to COVID vaccine because of the use in fetal cell in developing the product, not in creating the vaccine, but in testing it initially, which is a very remote connection and not a very convincing claim, but has been used in this context. And they claim that there's a clause in the Bible that says my body is my temple and therefore I can object to vaccines. That claim, the second claim, has been tried before, and most courts reject it because it's usually that one sentence in a letter about safety concerns. In Ringhofer versus Mayo, the court said, no, that's enough for a religious exemption. And worse, they also allowed a religious exemption from testing and masking, which raises the question, what do you do instead of vaccinating? No, nothing. Anyone who says that it's religion just gets completely off. It looks that way. In Keene versus City and County of San Francisco, again, a court allowed a claim, this time again on fetal cell, and the court didn't even allow the city and county to keep the employees at home during the litigation. They said you have to reinstate them now immediately. And the reason was, they said the employees were very distressed over being fired, and that is irreparable harm. You have to reinstate them immediately, which is a strange argument because anyone fired over violating a workplace rule is not going to be happy. They're reasonably going to be distressed. So why do we treat the distress differently because they're claiming a religious exemption that the city isn't convinced about? In addition to this, the courts have been making it harder to deny accommodation by raising the burden of accommodation. Historically, you could refuse an accommodation if you had an undue burden, and historically that was interpreted to say anything more than minimal cost. But in 2023, the Supreme Court, in a case about a postmaster that wanted a day off on Sunday, the Supreme Court said it's more than minimal cost. You have to show a substantial burden. What's a substantial burden? Well, we don't know. The court said you need to apply it fact by fact, take into account all relevant factors. We'll figure it out as we go. So employers that don't want to give an accommodation are going to face a lot of pressure. Also in the court, this is in state court, we've seen several jury decisions in which a lot of money was awarded to people who have been fired because their employer denied religious exemption to COVID vaccine. Now, I want to put this in context. There have been thousands of challenges to denial of religious exemption. A lot of them failed. These are 3 jury verdicts out of thousands of cases. So this isn't common, but it's going to scare employers from denying religious exemption because they really don't want to pay this kind of amount. I will say that these are cases that are pretty extreme situations. The Michigan case is a good example. In Michigan, there was a woman that was working remotely, and the employer wouldn't accommodate her even though she wasn't in the workplace. So these are pretty extreme cases, but employers are going to look at the amount and say, this is scary. I'm going to give anyone who asks a religious exemption, and we're seeing that. What can we expect going forward? First of all, we can expect anti-vaccine groups to aggressively litigate. We're already seeing that. California, my state, for example, had 3 cases against its lack of religious exemption to school mandates. And ICANN, an anti-vaccine organization, said they will sue in every state. You may be familiar with ICANN. ICANN's lawyer, Aaron Siri, has come to Arizona several times to give talks in the legislature. You can also threaten people behind the scenes that they will be sued if they don't give religious exemption, and that can work just as well as actual litigation. And we can expect states to have more policy supporting religious exemption, strongly cheered on by the courts. Finally, I want to say something about the administration. By and large, the federal government is a side actor on this religious exemption issue. But under the first Trump administration, President Trump appointed to the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Health and Human Services Roger Severino, who created an Office of Religious Freedom. And they tightened the protection of religious freedom by trying to pass a rule that would remove federal funding from any healthcare provider that didn't respect religious objections to procedures. That includes abortion, some vaccines, end of life decisions, right to die, and anything related to LGBTQ treatment. So they tried to put this rule in place. I will mention that it was held by the court. The court found it arbitrary and capricious, and that's because the main argument for the rule was an increase in complaint about violating religious freedom. But if you look at those complaints, they were related to school vaccination, which was not within the rule. And a lot of them were completely unrelated to the rule. So only 29 complaints were actually related from the rule, and that's not an increase. But I think we can expect the Department of Health and Human Service to revive the interest in religious freedom and tighten that. So I'm going to stop here because I want to leave a lot of time for questions, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, we have a question right off the bat. This one
Please.
comes from Erica. If someone is not vaccinated because of a religious claim, can they be held civilly liable for having spread a virus to someone else since they chose to take reasonable steps to limit their ability to transfer it?
So, first of all, if they took reasonable steps to limit their ability to transfer a virus, then they haven't, even if they're not vaccinated, if they took other steps that would be considered reasonable by a court, then they probably covered themselves. However, it depends if those steps are in fact reasonable, and there could be a lawsuit. For example, someone didn't vaccinate their child against measles, sent the child to school, the child infected someone's baby brother, and the baby brother got measles, because measles is very dangerous for young babies. You could see a case against the parents that didn't vaccinate. The religious exemption by itself would not be a protection. You can be unreasonable and legal at the same time. Not every legal action is reasonable. However, it's not going to be an easy case for a number of reasons. First of all, our system is generally unfriendly to claims of not acting. Most of the time, we don't have a duty to act. The example I use in class is if I am sitting and drinking a drink next to a pool and I see a baby crawl into the pool and start to drown and I keep just on drinking, I'm a morally horrible person, but I'm not going to be legally liable because there's no duty to act except in specific cases. So you'll have to argue that non-vaccination is some kind of action, and or argue for a policy exemption from the rule that there's no duty to act. And you'd have to show the other elements of the case. For example, causation. Sometimes it's hard to show that your specific non-vaccination infected other. For COVID, for example, it's hard to show where you got your specific case of COVID, so that might be an issue. So it's possible, but hard.
Okay. Here's one coming from Jay. Generally, can a school district deny enrollment to an unvaccinated student who has a religious exemption? And is the school district obligated to notify all other students, parents, and school staff of that student's exemption?
In almost no state can a school deny a religious exemption. So schools can't. Usually state law, especially for public school, but in many states also for private school, forces the schools to accept those kids that have religious exemptions. School doesn't have a choice. And generally, the school can't name the student at all. The FERPA, the Federal Education Protection Law, prevents the school from disclosing this kind of information about the student. But in some states, school can publish the rates of unvaccinated children. Arizona, as far as I know, is not one of those. So you need legislation for that. And as far as that could be, by the way, one thing to do: increase transparency by requiring schools to say what their vaccination rate is. But it's right now, I'm fairly sure your schools don't do that.
Hmm, okay. Um, Here's one from Annika. How do the courts decide what religions get the acknowledged status
Good.
to have exemptions?
So generally, the it's not by the religion. It's, does an individual person have a religious opposition to vaccine? So they don't even have to belong to an organized religion. They can write a letter saying, I've read the Bible myself. I've learned that God wants me to remain in the way that God created me without taking unnecessary medical interventions like vaccine. Uh, Here are two Bible verse, or you don't even have to have the Bible verse, and that would be enough for religious exemption. In theory, the courts are not supposed to police which religion you're in, and should be very careful in policing your beliefs as well. So it's not a specific religion.
Okay. Maddie asks, do you have any specific questions to ask vaccine deniers to help them question why they think the way they do?
Good. So uh, generally speaking, people can be convinced not to be anti-vaccine, but it needs to come from them to some degree. So generally speaking, you can open the door to someone to reconsider vaccine hesitancy, but you can't make them go through it. So the way the Voices for Vaccine has some wonderful material on how to talk to vaccine hesitant people, but the general suggestion is a consider, first of all, listen without judgment. Ask the person, what are your concerns, and listen seriously. Second, try to connect, explain, address the things that are common to you. Pretty much all parents care about their children, and often you'll hear the anti vaccine parents raise concern about their children. And they may have valid concerns. They may say correctly, we have pharmaceutical companies that are out to make money, and that's totally true. We have a healthcare system that's more geared towards profit than care, and that's totally true as well. We don't want to trust. So I would suggest understand where they're coming from, understand what they're concerned about, realize that some of their concerns may be perfectly reasonable and perfectly legitimate. Then it's worthwhile addressing one or two points as far as they're willing to have the discussion. Be prepared for the fact that it takes people time to rethink things they believe in, and that it may take time for people who are vaccine hesitant to consider their issues and go forth. And it requires some trust. You need to have a working relationship. Chances are you won't convince a stranger of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maddie, also going back to schools and notifications,
Mhm.
he wants to know, but we can ask the school what the rates are. Are they compelled to tell us?
No. Unless
Oh.
there's a law that requires it, they're not compelled to tell you. They may even feel that they're prohibited from telling you without such a law because they may be unsure what's the extent of my right to tell you things without violating FERPA. Schools might be nervous about that. Some states, so California, for example, has a site that has the rates of in each school. The Department of Health reports that, not the schools. Arizona can create a system like that, can create a system for
Mm.
sharing rates. It's a question of political will. Will
Mm.
it want to?
In Arizona, the political will belongs to one party and one party only. And, they're focused on taking us back to the 1950s. So there weren't a lot of vaccines, I guess, before the 1950s, and that's what they like. So it's a really strange state. Here's a question coming from Mark. And he says, I suppose this is a little off topic, but what is going to happen with employment, i.e., can a firm require that you be a verified Christian in order to work for a private nonprofit or even as we're seeing, maybe even government positions. He says, I'm thinking back to when I applied for a position many years ago at Grand Canyon University, which is a Christian university, private Christian university out here, and was asked by a personnel office by the personnel office to submit the name of my pastor so they could confirm how often I went to church and what kind of Christian I was. So going back off topic, what's going to happen with employment? Can a firm require that you can be a
Sure.
verified Christian? Sorry.
So first of all, there are some jobs to which the current protections have never applied. For example, religious organizations, if you're working at a church or a synagogue, they can um, have religious criteria. There's some exceptions to that. In addition, small employees, such as less than 15 minutes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 only applies to employers with 15 or more employers. So small employers don't have to abide that. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is still good law, and it prevents religious discrimination. And here's why I don't think it's going to be easily abolished. And then I'll say something about the Constitution as well. I don't think it'll be easily abolished because if you remove it, employers can also discriminate against Christians if they don't want them. And I think there's going to be hesitancy in allowing that. The Constitution has been interpreted by the courts to prohibit religious discrimination as well. That's for a government. I don't see that changing as well because I'm sure they'd be very interested in finding a way to draw lines that protect some religions and not others. But it's not an easy thing to draw, and they're going to have trouble with the language of the Constitution in doing it. In other words, because even the most religious of our judges and justices is going to want to protect certain religions, going to want to protect, for example, certain parts of Christianity, they're unlikely to remove the prohibition of religious discrimination. If they can find a way to weaken it for some groups and not others, they might try, but the prohibition of religious discrimination is likely to survive, and that will protect both kinds of people. Both people that are mainstream religion, small religions, and people who are not religious at all.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, I have another question here. And I don't know if you can answer this, but this person, I think it's Farrell again, is asking, is Moms for Liberty behind the religious exemption movement? And perhaps maybe you could speak to other organizations that are taking up this cause for their members.
So the first religious exemption in the modern times was adopted in New York in 1960, and it was because of lobbying by Christian scientists. In other words, the religious exemption debate long predated Moms for Liberty. At least if my
Yeah,
understanding is that they're not that old.
no.
So it's been before, and you can imagine that people who don't want to vaccinate have been using this avenue for a long time before Moms for Liberty. So I'm sure that Moms for Liberty supports this, or I'm guessing, I don't know. But it's predating them for a long time, as did efforts to gain religious exemption. There have been form letters. So I got into vaccine issues in 2012. There were already form letters online on how to get a religious exemption in 2012.
Hmm.
So it's not them. Part of it is anti-vaccine group, but it's also the reality that even individuals that aren't very strongly anti-vaccine but don't want to vaccinate for whatever reason may be tempted to reach for a religious exemption if that's the exemption available.
Hmm. Okay, so here's a question because so when I have children in their 20s, and so 28 and 25 years ago I was very much attachment parenting,
Yeah.
family bed, child-led weaning for breastfeeding, all the things, wore my baby in a sling. And there was a group of us who were comprised really of very far left people and very
Yes.
far right people.
Yes.
And it was my midwife actually. that had me questioning vaccines. I'm embarrassed to even talk about it now, and I eventually got all the vaccinations for my children, but it was a bizarre space to be in.
Yes.
Back then, it was the far left, and it was midwives, and it's still, I know quite a few midwives who are very skeptical of vaccines, and people who, I guess, the crunchy granola mamas, right? Can you explain, like, do you understand
Yes.
where that comes from?
Yes. So opposition to vaccine comes from a variety of sources. And historically, you're exactly right that we saw it most at the extreme of the political spectrum, extreme left and extreme right. So some of the anti-vaccine movement is not one skin, although it's starting to become one skin as conspiracy theories group merge together. But you can get to that, to vaccine hesitancy. First of all, some people get to it because something happened to their child and they blame vaccine. That can happen to anyone, anywhere. And
Mhm.
with the right setup, you would be actually reasonable in blaming vaccine. For example, in the 1990s, when they expanded the diagnosis for autism, and doctors we're now using the new very broad diagnosis, but they still haven't caught up with it. So for a lot of times they tell parents who were diagnosed under the new diagnosis, this child has no hope, institutionalize that child, even though that just wasn't true. And those parents went looking for groups. Some of the groups they got to were groups that offered alternative treatment for autism. And that connection, and those groups were hostile to vaccines because alternative treatment and vaccines are somewhat in tension. And that connection made those people blame vaccines very because that was their support group. That was the people that gave them hope. That was the people that also helped them deal with a system that's very unfriendly to parents of special needs children. Our system
Mm.
is horrible to deal with. So they listened to the people supporting them and they became anti-vaccine, and then it's hard to change once that's your identity and your support group. So some people get to it because something happened to the child and they blame vaccine. Some people get to it because they strongly believe in natural healing, as you said, and in natural remedies, and anything modern medicine is a bit in tension with that. It's easy to be suspicious of anything non-natural if you get to that. I will tell you that personally, I'm skeptical of the very natural approach because I think Mother Nature is as much out to kill us as anyone else. But that's a side issue. I can see why people are concerned about over medicalization. We do have real concerns about over treatment and so forth. Those are reasonable concerns that can make someone hesitant about vaccines. Then there are people who get into this because they are very mistrustful of government, and that can be people on the extreme left and the extreme
Mhm.
right, mistrustful of government and mistrustful of corporations. So you have that variety. So there are different paths to get to being anti-vaccine, and initially it was across the spectrum with more people on the extremes. Today we're more and more seeing anti-vaccine activism on the right, and that is connected to the politicization of the pandemic. I think we've seen it start a little earlier. We've seen it start of when the vaccine mandate battles of the 2015 and on were partisan. So the Democrats were for the mandate and the Republican against it, not 100%, but mostly. But since the pandemic, it's escalated dramatically.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm just checking here to see if there's a lot of comments here. So let's see. The U.S. Department of Education classifies Grand Canyon University as a for-profit school. However, the IRS and Higher Learning Commission, which regionally accredits GCU, classify it as a nonprofit. Yeah, yeah, it's a strange world we live in.
Yes.
People talking about Christian Scientists. Here's one. Okay, let's see. Is there a way, specific wording, bills that are already proposed to pressure representatives to strengthen vaccine compliance? I think not, but this is directly hindering my child's right to live free of diseases we have had under control. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Here's the bad news. The bad news is that the U.S. does not acknowledge a right to health as one of the rights we have under our constitutions. So that's the bad news. The good news is that there are some potential legal options. They're just going to be hard to use. So one thing that was used under COVID was using the American with Disabilities Act to protect immune compromised children when the states didn't allow schools to have mask mandates. That had some success. in it varied across but we could, for example, litigate to protect vulnerable children, especially immune compromised children, children with cancer, against areas that have low vaccine rates and high risk of disease. Well, we could try that litigation. In talking to your representative, I really think that we need to change the language to make it clear that disease outbreak and freedom don't go together. You have a disease outbreak in the school is going to close. You have a child affected by disease, a child loses their freedom. I think Robert F. Kennedy in his conference said that healthy people have a lot more freedom than sick people, and that he's right. He's just wrong in thinking where we see that. So claim back the freedom world. Remind people that, as you said, I like the way you put it, being free of disease we had under control is something meaningful. And we need to depoliticize this in the sense that we need to remind everybody that viruses don't care what your religious beliefs are.
Hmm.
If you have cells, they want you. And that we're nobody, whatever the religious belief, deserves to be harmed by a preventable disease. We all want people healthy. Vaccines help that. Vaccines have large benefit and low risks. Nothing is risk free, and you need to openly acknowledge that. Anything that's effective is going to have at least some risk. But the risks of vaccines are generally small, and you need to remind your representative that bringing back disease isn't going to increase freedom.
Yeah, agreed. Um, so there's a question here from Corey, and
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask it in a second, but well, I'm just going to ask her a question. Any recommendations on vaccines we should get in case RFK Jr. stops them, aside from the flu and COVID booster? And I got all mine. I got flu, COVID, pneumonia, what's the other one? Um,
RSV?
shingles.
Shingles, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I
Yeah.
got my shingles too, which tells you how old I am. Um, I think he's going to target the HPV vaccine if he can. I think he's going to be more careful about some of the childhood vaccines. Uh, so I don't think RFK will aggressively stop the vaccines because he'll be worried about the response. But what he could do is remove coverage. If you repopulate the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, their recommendations, insurance companies are required to cover the recommendations. So if they change the recommendations, insurance coverage is going to change. Uh, and we have a lot of children that get vaccines through the Vaccine for Children program. And the committee can change that program. So you should worry about coverage. If you have a child who's getting to the 4 to 6 category, where there's a whole bunch of second doses of vaccines recommended, if they're even close to that, you might want to act, even if they're a little under 4, check the rules because your school requirements might require over 4. But if your child is close to the category where they get vaccine, talk to the doctor about how early can you get the vaccine, schedule vaccine appointment. I think if you schedule them now, you're probably going to be okay even later. So look at who's close to getting a vaccine and get what you can.
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, the thing I'm really concerned. I'm really concerned right now about, the freeze on
Yes.
research, on health research. Like, it to me just feels like the end of, post-secondary education, and health research. It's
I think the
I
concerns are well justified. There's a rumor right now. I mean, a rumor. It was in the world, in the Wall Street Journal, that there's an executive order being prepared to cut thousands of people from HHS, which is already understaffed. I know that nonprofits are going through their materials and removing words they've been told to remove. Uh, it's going to be a big problem. A lot of nonprofits whose job is to increase access are very worried that they will lose their funding. So it's a very concerning time. I don't have easy answers for you. I
mm-hmm,
think one of the things we're seeing is litigation, and that's good. Um, but I don't have easy answers.
mm-hmm. This is a great question coming from Eddie, our development director.
Mhm.
How do we fight back against the new fake
It
news
is.
war where people are doing their own research in their own echo chambers?
So you can't prevent people from going places for information, but I think you're exactly right that we need to win the hearts and mind. The way we've been discussing this in immunization group is we need to increase the trusted messengers on the ground, and this is often less online and more local. Have local people go into community groups, churches, schools, etc., and bring good information. Local people that are relatable, that are kind, and essentially talk to people uh, in ways that help give them answers to the questions they have without them having to go look in the echo chamber, and give them good sources of information that they will feel comfortable looking at. We need to fight that war. It's going to be a hard war and a one by one. Um, we can't, again, we can't control everybody. We can't stop people from going places and getting information, but we can make it easier for them to access good information, to access people they can trust that will answer questions. And we need to dramatically increase our on the ground work to reach people. And we need to do it in a without. So some of my pro vaccine colleagues are we should just toss all the Republicans overboard. That's great, but you can't toss half the country overboard and think that you'll prevent disease this way. It's not going to work. We need everybody to be unvaccinated, just as we're going to need everybody uh, on board for a number of other issues that we need to change, such as climate change. So we
Mm.
need to do the on the ground local work, and it's not going to be easy. Now, the other thing is, the sad thing is, just like climate disasters, viruses talk. In other words, if we get a visible outbreak of a really bad disease, COVID was tricky in that it was mostly elderly people, and people are very good at ignoring harms to. I'm not saying that's good, but we are very good at ignoring harm to elderly people.
Hmm.
Um, and it wasn't so smallpox was visible. You had big pustules on your face. You had high mortality rates. If we get a really bad virus, the approach to public health will change. I hope we don't get that, but we are taking a risk there. We are really at risk of another bad pandemic.
Mm. Well, this is just a comment. First of all, I'd just like to say to everybody, it is so hard to keep up with the chat sometimes, but I love it. And everybody here just gives me life on Fridays. Y'all are funny and thoughtful, and I enjoy as much as I can try to pay attention. It's a good chat. But Janie says, I contracted polio when I was 3 and thankfully didn't spend a lengthy stay in an iron lung. Yet I did spend the next 77 years battling long-term effects. No child should have to suffer this when there is a
Amen.
vaccine for it. Amen. And
Amen.
that's me saying that.
Mhm.
Let's see. If we agree to brand them Trump scenes, will he let us keep them?
So I will say that President Trump did speak up in favor of the COVID vaccines, and always feels to me like a missed opportunity, because it really was a vaccine developed across two administrations, and we could have taken that moment of opportunity to try and decouple the issue from the political, but didn't happen.
No. And it's the same. I just listened to a podcast about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Hmm.
First of all, that man is an absolute monster. He is broken beyond repair. But like, his kids are vaccinated.
Hmm.
But he has no problem telling people, indigenous people in other countries, like, don't you do it though? Or,
Yeah.
it's fine for me, but not for thee kind of stuff. And so often and then they'll use it as an opportunity to peddle their snake oil, right? Whether it's ivermectin or I've got this special UV lamp or like here's some vitamins. It's always a grift with these folks, it seems.
Hmm. Yes.
Okay, here's a question. This is a great question too. Where do you suggest we get reliable information about bird flu or any of the circulating diseases since there is a ban on information from the CDC?
I
I
think,
am here.
yeah, I think I would like to owe you an answer on that. And I myself have been asking people, and I I'm trying to get the answers to that, but I don't have it immediately. Um, States, the health department often have really good data, but that's a state by state, and we could really use a national view. And I don't have a good answer on that yet. I'm looking myself. When I find one, can I email you guys? And
Abs Absolutely. Yeah, you can send it right to Lindsay and we'll make sure that everybody is updated
I'm
because
sorry, I know that's not a great answer, but that's where I am right now. Yeah.
you're all good. Um, yeah, Corey says I've started following trusted doctors and scientists on their Substacks. I'm getting information from a lot of independent journalists because I no longer trust the legacy media. I mean, I just saw today that, the Washington Post, they changed their tagline from democracy dies in darkness to, oh gosh, what was it? Hold on, I'm gonna be able oh, all of America. That, like, whatever that means, like, what an empty thing for a journalism agency to say. All of America, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, Midas touch. There's some great suggestions in here. Hopefully we don't get advised to inject bleach. No kidding.
Yes.
We need to keep RFK Jr. away from bears and people and rats and hamsters and birds too, because
Dogs.
what his cousin Caroline said about him. Oh my gosh, crazy. Let's
Dog.
see. Yeah. My dad was coming from Australia to the US on the Queen Mary and contracted polio at 3. He was quarantined for 3 weeks with no contact. He thinks a
Hmm.
lot of the person he ended up being was because of him suffering through that. That's tragic.
Hmm.
All right.
Oh,
This is a good question. The question is vaccine hesitation and anti-vaccine skepticism unique to the United States?
no, not at all. There's vaccine skepticism all around the world, and there's surprising similarities across places. I will say that the US organizations are very influential in that their content is being repeated by others, sometimes without noticing that their system is different from the US. But we have anti-vaccine movement in Australia. There are anti-vaccine speakers in Islamic countries. Um, there's anti-vaccine scares pretty much everywhere. Europe has a vigorous and very active anti-vaccine movement that led to really large outbreaks of measles throughout the 2010s, with children dying across the board in Europe in rates that we haven't seen yet, because thanks mostly to school immunization requirements, our vaccine rates for children are still relatively high. So no, it's definitely not the US thing.
Okay, well, I want to be mindful of everybody's time. The chat is again hilarious, and
Yes.
entertaining. Oh wait, here we go. There's one more. Wait. Oh, there's a question that I saw. This one comes from Eddie again. Is there any skepticism about vaccines that you understand where they are
Mhm.
coming from? My wife's family are Holocaust survivor, and they
So
peter on extreme views on vaccines because of the Shoah.
So, yes, there are quite a few vaccine hesitancy trends that I completely understand and sympathize. Although I think, if you take any belief that starts reasonable to the extreme, it can get you into trouble. So, you're rightly saying some people have bad experiences with abusive governments and have good reasons to mistrust government. We're seeing this, for example, in Ukraine communities in the United States. Uh, there was an outbreak of measles in Washington, in one of those communities that had low rates because they didn't trust government. There's a lot of communities that had really bad experiences with government and have good reason to trust them. Very religious Jewish communities are an example. Black communities have good reason to mistrust the medical establishment. So we have a lot of people who have what we call earned mistrust to the government, and when the government recommends vaccine, are going to be hesitant. The issue is those groups are actually often easier to reach than a more privileged group, because what you need to do is work with community leaders, give them honest, full answers, and the community leaders can work with their community to some degree. So yes, there are groups that have earned mistrust to government. There people who have good reason to mistrust the medical establishment. They had bad experience with their medical system, which is anything but perfect, and mistrust it. And it makes a lot of sense. Um, but again, it's a question of, so we had this discussion with some Black groups at the beginning of COVID when they said they want us to take a new vaccine. We remember that we can think to the Tuskegee experiment and other examples of bad treatment. Why would we trust this? And some of the leaders said to them, yes, we have good reason not to trust, but let's not cut off our own nose because of that.
Mm-hmm.
Taking it to the extreme can hurt us. But I think, yes, I think your anti-vaccine groups are very good at playing on those fears, and they have targeted some communities like that to increase this. But the initial mistrust is understandable. It's just bad if it gets into the place where these groups are hurt because of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been, first of all, I think we may have even broken a record today. I think this may have been one of our highest attendance events. So thank you so much, Dorit. I try to end on with the same question for guests every week. So in times where sometimes we can't always find hope, and all of our people that are here today are going to be going off into the weekend,
Yes.
what in this crazy world gives you hope, Dorit?
Most people vaccinate. Most people want their children and themselves to be healthy. If we can communicate with each other better, and if we can remember that the fact that someone adopted one or two crazy ideas doesn't make them a monster, though sometimes it can, it'll help. I would say, remember that you have tools to keep yourself and your children more healthy. But no, I'm not saying don't be angry. Be angry. But remember that so far we have a good immunization rates. So far we've kept disease at bay. We can keep fighting to maintain. We're right now fighting to maintain and not go back. We're in a better place than if we started with 3 out of 10 children dying and had to climb from there.
Mm-hmm. Fair. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna go ahead and I think it's Corey that said it. Just remember the dead Kennedys were right about everything. So with that, maybe y'all could listen to some dead Kennedys this weekend. It kind of sounds appropriate now after this discussion. Thank you so much, Dorit Rubinstein Reiss. I appreciate you so much, and
Thank
I
you.
hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you all. Great
All
question.
right.
I love the comments.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye.